cocoon, right? We don't even get we don't even get a proper sex education. That might be changing for some of you, but it's still not very different to how it was at that time. And then you go off to university and, you know, people are dating, people are having sex, and you're like, oh my gosh, you know, like the shame, the, you know, all these things that are fed into you, you know, should I have a boyfriend? But if I'm physical with my boyfriend, does that mean like I'm a bad woman or a bad girl? What will my parents think? You know, all these things kind of come into play, right? So I think it's a very formative period, at least from my experiences. The university period is formative, and we will talk about it much more in detail when we actually get into the session. But I think rather than being an activist or a disability rights advocate or anything, I'm coming into this as a woman who's been through that, and who's been young and confused and scared at some point in my life. And that kind of evolves, doesn't totally go away, right, given the social structures we have. But I'm actually participating today from that kind of standpoint.
Yeah. And I think if I could just add on there, I think most of us are also in university or going into university. And I think that leads us on into what Greetings from Lanka as a page and an organization is about, because we started specifically to address these confusions in university. We don't see ourselves as purely feminist in the terms we focus on women's issues as a whole, but the overlapping issues of gender and sexuality. So I think this is kind of the perfect starting point for our first webinar, and we're so glad to have you, Ms.Niluka, kicking things off for us. So before we get into the nitty-gritties and the burning questions, we thought that we'd do something a bit fun and interactive just to make this a bit more relaxed, because ultimately we want this to be a discussion. We feel that anything that we discuss is going to sink into our lives better if it's interactive as opposed to a lecture. We get enough of that at school and university anyway. So we have a bit of an icebreaker planned. Ms. Niluka, would you like to introduce the idea?
Yeah, okay. So like, let's look at our life course, right? When we are born, or when a baby is born, what is the first question we ask? Any ideas? Okay, come on. This is not like an assessment or an exam. No one's taking notes. Very simple, right? Let's say your, I don't know, sister or brother has a baby, and then you get a call saying, oh, the baby's born. What else in our culture especially? What would be some of the first things that you want to find out?
Is it a girl or a boy?
Thank you. Who said that? Yes. See, it's so simple. It's not complicated at all, right? One of the first things we ask is it a girl or a boy? And having thought about gender for so many years, it still happens to be one of the first questions that come to mind when a friend of mine says that she's had a baby or something like that, right? If you look at our life course, this whole idea of whether you're a girl or a boy, man or a woman, seems to define who we are. And when you say a girl's born, then in your head you have this whole future planned out for a girl, and then you have this whole future planned out for a boy, which could be very different, right? So I think in this icebreaker, what Shania is going to do is explore that a bit, right? What do we mean by it's a girl, and what do we mean by it's a boy?
Yeah, I think maybe earlier when we used to conflate gender and sex, maybe this question was a bit simpler, but it's not anymore. So really our question is, when I say the word woman, what are the qualities that come to mind? Because I know that there are qualities that come to mind in your head. It's just that now we know that it's not politically correct to say, oh, I think a woman is this and I think a woman is that. But no matter what, it's still at the back of your mind. So I'll go ahead and start it off. If I say the word woman, I do think sensitive and emotional. I consider myself sensitive and emotional.
Nice.
And I know that this isn't necessarily true, but I can't help it. It is what I believe.
Who wants to go next?
For some reason, I don't know why, but I just think of hair. Like, I think like long hair, which is quite common, but again, like women have all sorts of haircuts. I don't know why I think hair. Also, feel free to like post whatever you think in the chat if you don't want to voice it out. Who wants to go next?
Sonali,
You
do you want
can
to have a go?
either unmute yourself or you can just type it in the chat box and I'll read it out.
As oddly as this sounds, so with like Shania and what Dewey said, I also think of the possible school. Like that sort of runs in my mind for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe that's because like the school system is as such, it's so polarized and very out there in Colombo, especially. Like, if it's a girl, you would probably go to this particular school sort of a thing. Like that keeps on running in my mind if it's a girl as well. So yeah.
Yeah, we can be pretty judgy about school things too. That's not a problem. Okay, Nelumi says a gentle touch, and Anya says graceful.
Yeah.
So that's also, again, this idea of beauty and elegance that women have kind of been associated with for ages, right?
Yeah, it's all feminine. Kind of.
Ooh. Okay, Mikhail says, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm sorry if I'm not. Says something really interesting. I think of soft when I feel woman, but also for some reason resilient, like the kind of resilience that comes with pain. He also thinks that's kind of messed up. I don't think it's messed up because pregnancy, I mean, we associate the word woman with birth and pregnancy, and maybe, I mean, in my head, when you say resilience that comes with pain, that's what I think of. What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Mihal, and we'll come back to that during the discussion. I'm really glad you raised the point of resilience and the assumption that we have a lot of, what would you say, common pain as women that we undergo, right? That's also part of the oppression that we experience. And I was thinking, I always think of women as caring. You think of like mothers, sisters, people who are caring kind of in your life, right? So these, any other ideas or associations?
The minute
Okay, can we, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. The minute I hear the word woman, I go empowerment because I think over the years, I think I've gathered enough information to realize the struggle it is to actually be a woman in society today. So I think for me, it's more like, you said, it's more about being resilient, and it's more about kind of gathering the strength to be a woman in society today.
Okay, fantastic. I'll quickly, just for the point of comparison, can we quickly just come up with some ideas that come to our heads when we hear the term man, a man, or what is it to be a man?
If there are any men in the chat as well, we'd love to hear your opinions.
What makes you a man? So one of the most stereotypical things that come to my mind is like strong, right?
I had the same thought.
Okay.
Same.
Interesting, right? Strength. Okay. Anything
And
else?
also like sporty or whatever. Something
Right.
like
Athletic, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, the sporty thing was at the back of my mind too, but
yeah,
it's odd because I come from a girls' school where almost all of my friends were very, very sporty, and I think of them as sporty too.
interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Any other attributes of what it is to be a man?
I feel like I automatically, even whether it's man or woman, I think the first thing that comes into my mind are just my parents.
Nice.
Not
okay.
any particular attributes, but just like my mom and dad who come to mind.
Okay. So like a role model or an idea of who a man or a woman is
Yeah, I would
influenced by
think so.
parents. Yeah, that's true to a great extent. Yeah, good point, Alina. Any other thoughts on what it is to be a man? Okay, I'm sure you all have other ideas which will come out, but if you look at the kind of qualities that you mentioned, right? So for women, we said sensitive, emotional, graceful, beautiful, gentle, caring, and then we have resilience and empowerment, right? And for guys, we had strong, athletic, physical, physically fit, or whatever it is that we want to say. Have you realized, firstly, that a lot of the characteristics we associate with women are emotional, intangible, right? It's about your level of caringness, emotional strength and all that. Whereas for men, the only two things we came out with were very physical, right? About the physical capacity. And also earlier during the whole question about when a baby is born, what are some of the first questions that you ask? Amaya had said whether the baby is healthy or not. Okay, and that's a good question, because this is where the disability angle also comes in. But usually when we say like healthy or fitness, we also look at, are we healthy and fit to play our gendered roles, right? So a lot of us during the discussion said that pregnancy is part of being a woman, right? It's generally seen like that. But there are also lots of women now, especially, who make the choice not to become mothers, right? Or to get pregnant. But the thing is, when we think of fitness, for women, we think in terms mostly of a reproductive fitness, right? Are you fit enough to produce, kids? Are you fit enough to be a good mother? Yeah. But when we think about guys, the fitness we have, like that athleticism, right? Like the physical strength, even that idea of fitness that we have can change depending on whether it's a boy or it's a girl. Yeah. So the thing is, I personally think, yes, like Shania pointed out, there are differences between sex and gender, right? So sex basically refers to biological form. Okay, so as women, we have, ovaries, womb, vagina, breasts, all these sexual organs, right? So we have a sex body, but that is also quite complex, because you also get intersex people who have both male and female genitalia, right? And then it's further complicated by people who identify as trans, who don't relate to their body like, as a cisgender person who's born with those things. But if you look at the qualities that we expect of people, right, for guys to be physically strong, right, for girls to be caring and emotionally supportive, right, they are not exclusive. You can definitely get plenty of guys who are very like sympathetic and sensitive, right? And like you said, all your friends in school were girls and they were all sporty, right? The thing is, like, in reality, who we are is far more complex. But unfortunately, or I would say unfortunately, our stereotypes of the identity that we are supposed to have as males or females, like one of you mentioned about the long hair, right, for like females, it kind of like restricts us, and it kind of compels us to play certain roles, to look a certain way and to behave a certain way, right? Like when I was a kid, I loved like climbing trees. I loved playing with like toy cars. I remember, during nursery time, they had a play, and after the play, they gave gifts to all the kids who acted. And then I got a doll, and then all the guys got like cars, and I can remember being devastated and screaming and howling and making a huge fuss, right? It's like, why did I not get the car? Like, who wants this doll? But the thing is, like, see, from a very young age, like, we get socialized into thinking that children are a certain way, right? So it may not necessarily be naturally so, although I think there definitely are like feminine and masculine characteristics that we all could have, right? Like, regardless of whether we were born with a vagina or a penis, right? Like, we could all have masculine, feminine characteristics, which I think is important to keep in mind in terms of when you look at what can feminism bring to the world, right? Like a feminist perspective, what does that mean, right? So it is important at that level, but it doesn't mean it's like some like deterministic, if you are a man, this is how your life is. But the thing is, the society we live in, the roles we have to play, the institutions we have, they just keep affirming that that is what we have to be, right? So
Okay.
shall we move on to the next section?
Yeah, let's get into the questions. So we have a couple of questions that we've gathered from our form earlier, but we also want this to be a bit more spontaneous based on what we're talking about right here, right now. So any ideas that you have, feel free to, you can either raise your hand with the Zoom feature and just turn your mic on and talk to us when I call your name, or you could just type your message in the chat box and I'll read it out. So let's kind of get into just a first question, just a short one that kind of leads on from what you were talking about just now. Do you think that there is a correlation between sex and gender? Because a majority of people with female sexual organs do turn out to identify as women in terms of gender. But now we're trying to divorce the idea of sex from gender. Is there necessarily a correlation that just a majority of women, with people with female sexual organs will identify as women? Or is this something that is kind of like pushed on us by society? Should it be more fluid than that?
Yeah, see, it's interesting, Shania, because I think from the point of your birth, right, you are given a gendered identity. Like that's basically, I think, one of the first identities that you get. And we have so many identities, you know, of ethnicity, race, religion, and so forth, so on and so forth. And when you look at each of these identities, to belong to that group, you have certain like rules and expectations and regulations, right? Like if you belong to the group that we call women, right, how should you behave? And that's usually like determined by culture, right? Like don't wear short skirts, that's not a Sri Lankan woman. So then it's not just about being a woman, then the whole Sri Lankan part comes into it. Then someone will start talking about a Sri Lankan Buddhist woman or something, right? And then it becomes even more and more complex. But the thing is, this whole idea of what it is yes, culturally and socially constructed. But the thing is, it's not as simple as saying, oh, we just go with the culture, or we don't go with the culture. Because at the end of the day, you exist within that cultural framework, right? So it's not as simple as saying that we have made a choice, right, to kind of enact. So, and Butler talks about the performativity of gender, right? So we have all these expectations, and through the way we behave, the way we relate, we kind of manifest that. But the good thing about realizing that this is not, so the good thing about realizing these are cultural, social traits is that then you can step back and say, okay, what of these, you know, are acceptable to me or not, okay? Because you no longer think that it is one and the same, right? So to have these kind of discussions, and then also to look at people whose sexed bodies are not the same as their gender identity, right? Which is where a lot of this discussion around trans people come in, right? All this can happen because through, especially that's why I think feminism is important. It gives us that opportunity, at least conceptually, at least in terms of our values, to take a step back, you know, and not necessarily go with the flow of what it is to be anything really.
Yeah. So a lot of it might be ingrained, which means that we might not have had a choice at the outset, but later on, yeah, we might develop the ability to have a choice, and then it's important to use it. So that gets us on to our next question, which is an audience submitted one, which is, how do you maintain your womanhood and get the job done?
Awesome question, right? I love this question. Firstly, I would say womanhood. Okay, so then we're like different ideals of what womanhood is, right? Like, just to make it more clear, because lots of people think, you know, womanhood is the same across cultures, right? It necessarily isn't. You know, if at like ancient civilizations, or like the Mesopotamian civilization, fertility was like revered. Women played the roles of the priestesses, you know. And so right now, like when you talk about women in religion, in most of the modern religions, you're like, oh, they don't get leadership roles, right? But if you look at the history and different cultures, like women have played very different roles. So the whole idea of what womanhood is in and of itself, okay, is something that is not static over space and time. That said, what is the job to get done? Is the job to sweep the floor and feed the kids, right? So in a very stereotypical way, you would say, yeah, she can get the job done. She can cook, you know, her husband's meal at 5 in the morning and have the kids ready and send them to work, okay? Is that what we're talking about in terms of getting the job done? Or when you say get the job done, are we thinking about being like productive in workspaces, right? So it's interesting. I came across some interesting statistics here. So it says, this is from a UN study, it says 30%, 35% of the working population in Sri Lanka are female, right? So when I saw this, I was initially like, is that true? Because we find that a lot of people, a lot of women, especially in our countries, right, work as domestic workers, right, and domestic helps, right, work as nannies, work as cleaners. All these jobs are part of the informal economy. Yeah, we don't consider them jobs when it comes to economic statistics. So although there's this idea in economics that only 30%, 5% of the women work, if you look at, you know, the informal economy, if you look at the black market, I would say there are far more women involved, right? Then there's the other question, right? So the whole thing of getting the job done. If a woman cooks for the family, they get the job done by fulfilling their duties. If a man cooks in a restaurant or a hotel, they get paid for it. Okay, so it's really interesting. Like the job is about cooking, right? But the woman does it in a private sphere, and it's not given any economic value. A man does that in the public sphere, right? And it's given this fantastic economic value, and you know, you have your own TV show and whatnot. Yeah. So what do we, again, when we often think of women as restrained to that private sphere of reproduction, of care, okay, and then, and even so then when, like in Sri Lanka, for example, the representation of women in parliament has never exceeded 6%. Like 6%, that's nothing. When in terms of the female population, we constitute 52% of the population. So 52% of the population represented in parliament by less than 6% of women. I mean, that in itself, you know, kind of reveals that inequality that comes with, again, I think the cultural expectation that women don't like belong in politics. You know, I think it was there's an ad, I believe it's a Sunsilk ad, right? And as problematic as it is, there is this thing where this girl is running for student union presidency, right? And the guy is like, don't worry, why do you want to, you know, like kind of get sweaty and tire your body, we'll take care of things. She's like, no way, dude, I'm gonna do it, right? So the whole idea that, oh, girls are not suited for politics, they shouldn't be on stage speaking, they shouldn't get their beautiful skin, you know, exposed to dust or whatever, and that's what that ad is about, right? So again, it's like, it speaks to, and I think that's where younger people like you guys are really stepping out and saying, hey, it's fine, I can like go home and have a shower with Sunsilk or whatever, you know, and get on with my political campaign, right? So it's like that, and there's also this then idea of the unencumbered worker, right? So the unencumbered worker is a worker who doesn't have any other duties and obligations, so that they can fully participate in their workplace, right? So they don't have any distractions. Now, if given the Sri Lankan context, who can afford to be an unencumbered worker? It's the man, like usually a husband who has a wife to take care of everything, the kids are taken care of, the meals are taken care of. What do you have to do? You just work. So you are the unencumbered worker. So culturally, our idea, when we have that male preference, it's actually the underlying thing is the unencumbered worker. And as soon as a woman comes, and I think we're covering a couple of questions here, right? As soon as a woman comes, right, for the interview, one person in this forum had asked, in terms of having kids, right? People would say, especially, let's say, you know, women in their 20s, 30s, do you plan to have kids? Are you married? And that should have a bearing on your employment. No one is going to ask a guy that. The assumption of the guy is married, the guy is married, and that's a good thing because that means the wife will take care of everything and he just has to work, right? Whereas if you're a woman and you talk about being kind of married, then the question is, well, what if you have kids, right? So let's say from an economic standpoint, yes, it's valid. Why would we want to hire someone who's going to go on maternity leave? But that is because, again, culturally, we think that taking care of kids is the role of a woman. Again, coming back to womanhood and doing the job, right? So we think that taking care of kids is a part of womanhood. But if we look at countries like in Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, right? Men, fathers get as much paternity leave as mothers. The assumption is that fathers do take care of the child. So the problem is not that a woman is getting pregnant or that the woman has children. The problem is that we put the whole burden of care on the woman. We expect her to do all this, and we also then expect her to become an unencumbered worker. Like how, right? So it's quite complex that way.
So we've actually got an interesting question from Amaya, where she's asking, aren't things changing now? So nowadays, if you're considered an independent and individual person, you're kind of expected to fend for yourself and feed yourself and be doing your own laundry regardless of the gender. I'm sorry if there's background noise.
Okay. Yeah, no, this is interesting, right? That's a good question, Amaya, because one thing is this whole idea that, women have to sweep and cook, and men, God knows what, like fixers, sinks, a very distinct kind of differentiation of activity based on gender, right? We have that. But as you said, nowadays, I think with the younger women and also younger guys who know how to cook, and they have to go to uni, they have to learn to fend for themselves, things are changing. I think in our generation, in your generation, things are different, right? But I think here the underlying thing again comes back to, for me, like about care, right? Who is expected to be a carer? And in Sri Lanka, still that falls under like the ambit of mothers. Like I do a lot of work with children with disabilities, right? So even there, what you see is, this is where the distinction comes, right? Like fathers and mothers, yes, they care. But in terms of, like, for example, for children with disabilities, often if a child with a disability is born, it's the mother who is blamed, right? You must have done something wrong. Hi guys, can you hear me? You can, right? Sorry. So you must have done something wrong when you were pregnant, or you must have taken some kind of pill, okay? Or you must not have been cautious. So what I'm trying to say here is that despite that, this whole mother blaming kind of woman blaming, right? So I did some research with veterans, right? With disabilities, soldiers who acquired disabilities. And there again, there was this thing where families would blame the wife's bad luck, bad karma for the husband who's a soldier, then acquiring an impairment, which is like, for me, I was like, wow, that's like a long shot, but it happens, right? So the thing is, great, while these practical aspects are changing, we also need to make sure in terms of like shame, stigma, culture, that these assumptions, so women either being women being the carer, women being the cause of misfortune, all these kind of stereotypes that we have, they also need to change. Otherwise, these kind of changes are going to be only relevant to a very small, like educated urban elite, right? But we're talking about at a national level, where are we going?
Yeah. So though expectations might slightly change sometimes in a practical sense, yes, technically there isn't anything legally holding you back from free and fair employment and voting and being a member of parliament. Society isn't always as fair. And I think when it comes to society's perceptions, we've got another really cool question coming in, which is about Kasturi Wilson. So a quick like background for anyone who doesn't know, she was actually appointed to be the CEO of the conglomerate Hemas, which is a huge company in Sri Lanka, and she is the first female conglomerate. So when she was appointed a couple of weeks back, social media went ablaze. Everyone was congratulating her. And they were also not just congratulating her for being the CEO, but for being the first female CEO. And they were also attributing a lot of praise to the fact that despite being a woman, she made it up. So the question reads, is it fair or is it right for us, if we're trying to normalize women being in these positions of power, especially through a form of merit, is it right for us to make such a huge deal when a woman makes it to CEO? Because we don't make such a big deal if a man makes it to CEO. We don't congratulate them the same way. We don't say, oh, this is a victory for your gender. So is it fair that we made a big deal about Kasturi Wilson? Should we not have? Or was it actually something that made a lot of sense?
So that's a great question, right? I'm just going to look at three things. So today I was thinking about this aspect earlier in terms of the stats for our country, right? So if you look at universities, you'll realize that now more than ever, more and more women are attending universities and obtaining degrees, right? Which is fantastic in terms of like empowerment and capacity building. But it still remains that nearly 65% of women who get degrees in our country do not go on to work in the workforce, right? So then you're just like, wow, what's going on? Because we often feel, oh, things are much better now. Girls are, doing much better at their A-levels. They are getting to university, but why are they not going beyond that? Okay. So again, this comes back to our gendered expectations. A lot of women just get out of uni, get married, and that's it. And then then don't progress further in terms of careers, right? So that's a certain reality for some people in our country. The other reality then is that the women who work, like I mentioned earlier, work at very low levels, right, in terms of manual laborers, factory workers, right, like garment factory workers. So at a very kind of, so not at that senior management level, right? About 9% of our GDP comes through the domestic work that our women do in countries, in the Middle East and abroad. But the thing is, again, that kind of employment is at a very low level, and they're very vulnerable, and it's a precarious kind of situation. So the point here is that, yes, there are women in the workforce. Sometimes the educated women aren't going into employment. And also most of the women who are out there are in low-skilled, low-level employment, right? If you look at Sri Lanka and the participation of women in senior management, only 28% of women, okay, have participated in senior management. 28%, that's quite low, right? Given that we have such a high level of education for women. So then we're like, where is this mismatch, right? So here is when this whole concept of the glass ceiling comes in, right? The whole idea of an unencumbered worker, the notion that, hey, if you are, a guy who doesn't have all these other obligations, you are more likely to play that role. We still have the whole concept of a boys' club, right? Where at that higher level, management level, there's a lot of kind of like camaraderie. Or hey, maybe you went to Royal, you went to St. Thomas's, I went there. That kind of thing happens. The girls' clubs happen too, and maybe this is a time where we need to like push for the girls' clubs to kind of have greater influence. But the thing here is that largely culturally and socially, why we think it's a great deal, right? Even when Jayanthakuru Utumpala became the first person to climb Everest, right? And it was like a woman who climbed Everest. It's because all these women, if you look at the social cultural landscape that we have been talking about, okay, so an unencumbered worker, unencumbered kyanne, let me think, what is burden in Sinhala would be, one second. Okay, among unencumbered worker එක පොඩ්ඩක් කියන්නම්. ඒ කියන්නේ අපිට අපේ රස්සාවට අමතරව වෙන යුතුයකම් තියෙනවා නම්. හරි? අපිට රස්සාවට අමතරව වෙන වැඩ නැත්තම්, වෙන යුතුයකම් නැත්තම් අපිට 100% අපේ රස්සාවට නැඹුරු වෙලා අපේ රස්සාව ගැන concentrate කරන්න පුළුවන්. ඒත් අපිට රස්සාවට අමතරව ළමයි බලා ගන්න, අම්මලා තාත්තලා බලා ගන්න, ඉන්ලෝස්ලා බලා ගන්න, ගෙදර බලා ගන්න. ඉතින් ඒක තවත් මැනේජ්මන්ට් පොසිෂන් එකක් වගේ නේ. ඇත්තටම බලන්න අපි ගෑනු ගෙදර කුක් කරනකොට ඒක අගයන්නේ නැහැ. ගෑනු ගෙදර මැනේජ් කරනකොට ඒක අගයන්නේ නැහැ. ඉතින් ඒකත් ඇත්තටම වෙනස් වෙන්න ඕනේ, right? අපි මොනවද ගෑනුන්ගේ ශ්‍රමය කොහොමද අපි අගයන්නේ කියන එකත් වෙනස් වෙන්න ඕනේ මේකෙන්. ඒ කියන්නේ අපි කියන්න හොඳ නෑ මේ ගෙදර ඉඳගෙන වැඩ කරන එක ඉන්වැලිඩ් කියන එක නෙවෙයි. ඒක අපි අපේ දෘෂ්ටි කෝණය වෙනස් කරන්න ඕනේ. හරි? අන්එන්කම්බර්ඩ් වර්කර් කියන්නේ අපි හිතන්නේ සාමාන්‍යයෙන් අපේ සංස්කෘතියේ ජෙනරල් assumption එකක් තියෙනවා. මිනිස්සුන්ට ඒ වගේ වෙන distractions වෙන යුතුයකම් නැති හින්දා 100% මේ රැකියාවට යොමු වෙන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. Right? ඒ අදහස. I think so the thing is that kind of societal ඒ වගේ සමාජික just should I do it in Sinhala and English or what do you think? What do you guys think?
Is there anyone here who would prefer to have the Sinhala translations running alongside? Because it's totally fine. We have time.
I'll do it. Shall I do it a bit in English and then summarize in Sinhala a bit like that?
Okay, sure. We can do a Sinhala summary every 2 or 3 questions, maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. So the thing is, like, when you look at this is again where you have to look at structural inequality, right? A lot of people think why like I think Shania, you and I were talking about this earlier, the Black Lives Matter movements, right? Everyone goes, Black Lives Matter. No, all lives matter. Why are you saying Black Lives Matter? And there are people who get really alarmed, right? And people are thinking, does it mean that the Black lives are more special? Why are, you know, and you're like, no. You know, it's the same thing when we talk about like feminism and we talk about women's oppression. We're not trying to say that women are special or, you know, that men don't matter, you know, and those are some of the stereotypes we have. But what we're trying to show is in terms of structural inequalities, right? So from access to education, access to politics, access to health, access to management positions in companies, right? And also the underlying social and cultural barriers, if all that is there is an existing inequality, right? So when we focus, again, similarly for race, right? If you have the history of slavery, if you have this history of oppression, you have to then deal with those structural inequalities. So the reason, even with disability, right? Like the reason we focus on those issues is not to say that the others don't matter. It's to show that no, there are certain inequities that we need to take care of. Right? And that's where affirmative actions, that's where quotas coming, not as some special favor, but as a recognition that historically there has been this inequality and oppression, right? So to change those things, then we do need to take positive actions.
Okay, so cool. Amaya had a cool question for us. She says, I think this was related to when we were talking about how low the numbers are of women actually entering the workforce or entering higher levels of management instead of just staying at this like domestic worker or manual worker, admin worker level. So she says, what if it's the girl's choice to stay back at home? What if these numbers simply represent that women prefer being at home and not being at the workplace? And also secondly, there's a pressure the opposite way on men to be the breadwinner. So it's the opposite kind of pressure that is on women. So men actually have additional pressure to get into these management roles and stay there, perhaps against their choice. So does that somewhat weaken the argument for quotas? Does that change how we should look at these gender inequalities?
No, actually, it's really good. This is fantastic because remember when we started, we were talking about if a boy is born or a girl is born, right? And the gendered expectations we have of people. Both these things of men having to be breadwinners, having to be strong, having to be non-emotional, right? Be tough. Okay, in this UN study, they looked at Sri Lankan Sri Lankan men's perceptions, and I think about 56% of them thought that men have to do anything in their capacity to protect the honor of their family. right? So it's very interesting, this concept of honor, like protecting honor, which then leads to other issues of violence comes in, right? So we, from the time this baby is an infant, even for boys, so when you talk about gendered expectations, right, this is actually not just about women, because it can be equally oppressive for men, right? I know friends who want to be like chefs or hairstylists. They're like really deemed, you know, unmanly kind of thing, right? Like if you want to be a hairstylist, you're like, oh, you know, you're not really a man, you know. That I've seen that happen to people that I know, right? So and that's where this whole thing later, when we talk about sexuality, this whole thing of playing gender roles, you know, in a heterosexual context also becomes important. So this is a good question, because yes, it could be the girl's choice. If it is the girl's choice, and the other thing there, then there is the issue of why do we devalue domestic work, right? Why is it not seen as work? How can that be seen as work, and count in the larger economic system? Because at the end of the day, these jobs need to be done, right? The job of the carer, the job of the cleaner, the job of the factory worker. But the issue is, again, when we look at this heteropatriarchal system, right? Things that don't that are not seen as profitable, right, are devalued. So the feminist perspective here, from like my opinion, would be to really rethink about how we look at care, right? And how we look at this different range of ways in which we use our bodies, and the ways in which we use our do our work, right, in our economies. So that's where the feminist economic like angle can hopefully make a difference. Like for me, you know, uh, if all the cleaners, right, in Sri Lanka stopped working for one day, we are all going to be in a fix. Yeah, it is as essential as many other jobs, but the way we hierarchize, you know, we attribute value is for me, like a lot of issues of oppression also kind of are linked to what kind of value we attribute to different people and different bodies, and the way we value people's capacity, right? So yes, it could very well be a girl's choice to stay back at home, but firstly, it's like, what are the social cultural pressures behind that, right? Because again, I should share that study with you, because there was the perception among both men and women that women should stay home and take care, you know, of kids. So that's a predominant cultural idea of what it is to be a good mom or a good woman, right? So then the next thing is, again, what we want is not a situation where people are trapped into their gender roles, right? Like just because you are a man, you need to be the breadwinner and you need to be like the head of the corporation, right? How can we make that less kind of imposing and less prescribed, you know? So that's where this conversation really is important.
Yeah, I think just having the conversation in itself helps, because then you're just more conscious about it, right? Now we're going to move on into the education section of our little webinar now. This is kind of what most of us are going through, if not will go through. And it's a question that maybe Ms.Niluka, having gone through it already, can give us some enlightening ideas on. How do you navigate sexuality and issues of sexuality on the campus? What are the issues you have come across that you felt you were unprepared for? And how did you end up preparing for them? What kind of support did you wish was there when you were going through it?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for that question. So I actually didn't go to university here. I went to university in the US. Okay, so that might create a bit of a difference in terms of the university culture, right? But then also, I think regardless of that, because right now I work as like a visiting lecturer and a consultant at universities here in Sri Lanka as well, it also gives me an idea of what the terrain is like, you know, for young people with navigating their sexuality here, right? So there are, for me personally, coming out of Sri Lanka, you know, at the end of my A-levels, right, from a very protected environment where I didn't, in schools, we didn't have sex education. Even now, that doesn't really happen except for a handful of schools, right? And I hadn't really even like thought about my sexuality. And I think from a personal perspective, this whole idea for, virginity is very important. And again, that whole concept of honor, right? Like protecting the honor of your family, blah, di, da, di, da. It's kind of like Mulan song, she'll bring honor to us all. That's the kind of thing, like we're like trained to bring honor to our families. But it's tough, like for Mulan, right? So I that's what I found. So going into university, people dating, people having sex, I was like totally not ready for that. And I think I hadn't really thought about my own sexuality, consent, what I'm comfortable with, what I'm not comfortable with. And I think in my first relationship, like going into that, it became really very difficult for me. And I was like traumatized because I was like, oh my God, I don't know what's happening, kind of thing. So I don't know if you guys are as bambish as I was, but I think for, a lot of people, because when we look at, so University of California is where I'm doing my lecturing, right? There's very high incidence of illegal abortions, among kids on campus. Actually, in our country, 600 abortions take place on a daily basis, illegal abortions. Okay. And when they looked into, okay, why is this happening? One of the reasons were that especially a lot of women, like young women, didn't know how pregnancy happens. So they're like, oh, we did that. But, now like for us, we might be listening to this and going, how did you not know that that's how a baby is created, right? But for a lot of us, it's not so, right? And especially people coming from very protected rural communities, right? It's like a huge culture shock as well, right? If you have been very protected in your younger years as a woman. So this whole thing of even to talk about women's sexuality in our culture is very taboo, right? Like we don't talk about our sexuality, we don't talk about pleasure, right? But I think this is where you guys, your generation can kind of step in and to destigmatize that. Because if you're going to be silent about it, right, and then just kind of asking friends, and friends are also not sure what is what, and it's a mess. But at least now with the internet, I think things are changing. But I think something we need to do is to destigmatize female sexuality, right? To be open, to talk about consent. Especially, I think for me, I really struggled with that concept, as a young person. Like, what if I don't like something and my partner wants that? And how do I say it? Do I have a right to say it? Like you feel like, because no one talks about it, you feel so isolated, right? And then you're like, shit, what am I going to do, right? So kind of changing that dynamic is really important. And even, the conversations around abortion, like having that in university campuses. If we have 600 abortions a day in our country, with many being from young women, right? Like you guys, that is traumatic to go through an abortion. That's a really tough experience. But who is providing that support? We are not supporting each other through that. So I think it's actually a very serious thing. Like, and it is so good that you have started at this point. But that needs to kind of start involving more people who may not be as comfortable talking about sexuality. So I think that's really something as women in Sri Lanka we need to work on.
Yeah, I think I'd like to actually open up a small moment for the audience to participate here too, since most of us are at this age of school and university and relationships all coming together. So Shanali, you're at local uni, she's at Pera. So Shanali, have you felt like you've been able to talk about sexuality, dating at university, or has it been like a taboo topic? Janali, you're muted.
So I think in general, this concept of sexuality in a Sri Lankan local university campus, there's like a lot of frustration, like, where questions go unanswered, and in general, we are just there's like a lot of sexual frustration, and that is brought out through varying aspects. Mainly, I have seen it come out through ragging, where the ragging, especially at the university that I am in, is very sexually orientated. Like, they focus effects on your sexuality, and there's a lot of bullying, and actually there have been very fatal effects of this suppressed sexuality in the university. So yeah, I think that is my experience with sexuality and university. I don't think there is a safe space for kids who are trying at this age, trying to kind of come to terms with what their sexuality is. I don't think we've opened the conversation about how, you know, you don't only have to be with a guy if you're a girl, or you don't have to be with a girl. You can be with a girl, you can be with a guy if you want to be. Like, there's no conversation, and people are bullied if their sexuality doesn't align with society's expectations. So I think there's this whole stigma surrounding, you know, sexuality, and that we really haven't had the conversation yet at a university level. So that's my experience. Is there anybody else who is at a local university or at a local school that would like to share the experience? Please go ahead.
Someone raise their hand. You want
Okay. Any word of advice to those hoping to attend local university? Important.
Right? Yeah. So it's interesting. Thank you, Shanali, especially for sharing your experiences. And I think especially in the context of ragging, right? I know that ragging is actually, it's very interesting how sexuality is a very complex subject, right? Like sexuality can range from pleasure, intimacy, connection to, you know, violence, subjugation, domination, right? So it's like, if you look at a spectrum of sexual experience, it's quite vast. And it's very sad that I think sexuality is used as a foundation for ragging in our country, but even in other countries, right? If you want to join a fraternity or sorority, right, you go through hazing. Hazing is basically the same as ragging or bullying. And even then that concept of sexualized ragging comes into the fore. And I think that can be really kind of scary and like put you off, right? Because one thing I think needs to happen, and we are actually starting this. I'm part of a group, and I'd be happy to share this with you, where we are looking at because we have the act on ragging from '96, but it's not really getting implemented, right? So how to hold universities accountable, and also to change the conditions of student life across universities. So I know that this is not something you're doing personally, but I want you guys who have undergone, you know, hazing of a sexualized gendered nature. Later on, even you can contact me, because we are trying to work on that as a group, right? I'm sure others might have ideas on your response as a personal level, because I know it's easy to say no to bragging, you know, stop, but it's very hard when you're in a communal environment. And when you have that dynamic, you know, and power imbalance, and someone new with, you know, the older kids, it's very hard to do that. Yeah. So I really think there needs to be structural changes, but maybe some of you have other experiences as well.
Yeah. Anya said she has an experience that she'd like to share. So Anya, if you want to unmute and even turn your video on, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is not like something that happened to me, but like kind of still in school. So a few years, I mean, even now I have friends who have like, um, discovered, oh shit, like this is my sexuality and what do I do? Because obviously like now it's really hard to accept that part because, a majority of people in school would kind of judge you and kind of, do sorts of I don't know, probably put you in very hard situations, right? And as much as it was a really confusing time and I'm still kind of conflicted on it, but as much as I would like people to accept that part of themselves, because like that is obviously like you have to, irrelevant of what society says. Um, it was I also like I it was really hard because I know a lot of people who have accepted that part of themselves, which is obviously really great, but um, like being bullied in school, and obviously like even whatever sports or whatever clubs they were in, they were put through a lot of pressure. And like even people would come up to me in school and would say like, don't you know this person is that, and I'm just like, I mean, it's just whatever, right? So it's kind of a question, as in, yes, it's all right it's obviously we have to accept that part of themselves, but is it okay to kind of, I mean, should you like tell everyone when you're ready, or is it bad to hide that part of themselves knowing that you'll probably get bullied or whatever? It's a kind of a question, kind of a small thing, if that makes sense.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm really glad you did, because I will tell you my story. Okay, so I consider myself bisexual, so I'm attracted to both men and women. Like not everyone. Everyone thinks bisexual, so you're like sexually attracted to everybody. You're like, no. Because you're straight doesn't mean that every guy is like, kind of on your radar going, ooh, it's a man. It's not like, there are so many stereotypes, right, when it comes to sexuality, and people especially find bisexuality to be very hard to understand for some reason, which I don't. But I can remember, being in school, being in university. I mean, these are the times when you have like a lot of questions about what is my sexuality, why is it good or bad. And in a culture, if you're often told same-sex attraction is sinful or bad or illegal and criminalized, you tend to just like internalize it quite a lot. And you can have this sense of badness of, oh, me having that kind of desire is somehow not good for me, my family, and things like that, right? So I mean, I really experienced that quite a lot when I was younger. And I can remember, like I told you, like it's again the South Asian perspective, right? So at our university there was a club for LGBTIQ students, right, to come. And then I was just like, again, but what if someone sees me going into that club, especially my South Asian friends, like what will they say? They will think, I'm gay, and that's so bad. And I remember like sitting at the club and, looking over the window, trying to make sure no one saw me in there, so the whole thing of like that internalized shame and stigma is very real for us. And it's not even untrue, because one of my, then again, the South Asian friends, she was an Indian college friend. And then she comes to me, during lunch one day and says, so I heard you are a lesbian, huh? And I was like, what? And I think I told her something funny like, oh no, it doesn't matter what's under the belt for me. Like I could go either way kind of thing. So, but then when that does happen, like it really puts you in such an awkward position, right? And I think like shame would be one of the big things that like come to mind, because it's always seen as something unique, right? Like a freak show, like the transgender kid, the lesbian, the bisexual, I mean, there's definitely far more acceptance and far more understanding now. But I think generally, we talk about internalized homophobia, right? Like, at least from my perspective, that is a reality for a lot of us.
Yeah. And maybe this is a bit of a tough question. I don't know if it's one that we can come to a single answer on, but if there is anyone, any of our friends, any one of us right now who is genderqueer, or not cis in their identity, and is in local university or a local school setting that they feel could be oppressive, but they have identified that they are gay or they are bisexual or they are trans, as a friend, should you encourage them to come out and explore their sexuality instead of hiding it, knowing that there is so much flack on this community, knowing that it can be so tough once you do come out? Do you encourage them to maybe stay safe until they're out of school, or do you tell them to come out and own it now? How do you advise someone in a situation like that? How do you come to terms with the fact that the world is a harsh place, but you do need to face your sexuality at some point?
Yeah, Shania, that's a really good question. Um, I think coming out, it's interesting, like the whole concept of coming out, right? Like if you look at other identities like race or physical disability or whatever, you don't have to necessarily come out. But if you, let's say, have an invisible disability, maybe you do, right? Maybe you have chronic fatigue syndrome or a psychosocial disability. Often it's when something is invisible that you have to, like, in that sense, come out and state this is, right? As part of who you are and part of your identity. But I really think, okay, as I'm now speaking from the perspective of someone who is in the LGBTIQ community and given my own experiences, right? I think coming out is a very personal decision, right? And also, especially if you're still under the guardianship of your parents, right? And you're still in school or uni and you haven't left home. And if they're, your parents are not likely to look at that favorably, right? So there are risks associated with coming out, right? With coming out, you may be subject to bullying, you may subject to, eviction from your home. Like, these things are not unreal because it has happened to people, right? So I think personally coming out is important, but it's also important to look at the risks and the what the vulnerability that may bring, right? So for example, in my case, I told you I went to the LGBTIQ organization, but it was actually my best friend who took me there first, because she realized that I was just like all over the place, and I was like, oh, I don't know if do I like girls, I don't know if I do, oh my gosh. And then she was like, no, let's just go and check this out, right? So she never told me, no, you don't have to figure out who you are or you need to come out, because actually I think for a lot of young people, sometimes it's not very clear cut, right? Like, sexuality can be very complex, and just to then like pick an identity and come out to that identity can be different, especially at that age of, late teens, early 20s. So the good thing she did was that she supported me to find a community, supported me to find help. And that is something I think any ally can do, just hold space for that person. Like you said, like the previous I can't remember, Anisha, is it? No, Amaya, right? I think Amaya. Anyway, bad with names. But like she said, it's very hard for us to be ourselves and talk about our crushes or whatever it is. Like, hold space for them. Like, let them be who they are. That is one of the biggest gifts. Like, if I look back at my experiences, it's the friends who have been like, yeah, so tell me about like that girl crush of yours, and and you, without being like in your head going bad, you know, uh, just that in itself can be really transformative. And I think in your generation, things are changing. People are more open and less judgmental. There are lots of services, like and facilities available if you're not lots, but more now than before, right? If you're LGBTIQ, if you're trans and questioning. So I mean, if you guys later wanted to connect, I can give you some like pointers as resources. But like that, like my friend taking me, sometimes maybe it's scary to go to a place like that alone, right? So maybe you could volunteer, hey, I'll come with you or something. So these little things that may not seem as like transformative acts can make a huge difference for your friend, when you're an ally. And I think coming out is, especially in Sri Lanka, a bit tricky, and it's something that you need to really think through, and then it's a very personal decision at the end of the day.
Yeah, there's really no singular answer, is there? Especially because you can come out to your close friends, you can come out to your family, you can come out to everyone who you meet, but there's just so many different degrees of it. So it's a personal decision at the end. Okay, so I think we unfortunately have to wrap up soon. But let's kind of go into something a bit more personal that I think a lot of us have had to deal with. the word feminist. It's so polarizing. It gets so much flack. Is it wrong to have the word feminist now, when feminism especially is trying to be intersectional and also represent men's interests, especially since modern feminism talks about men who are the victims of domestic abuse, of domestic assault, of men who have been wrongly wrongly prosecuted for rape allegations, and women who have gone scot-free for making false rape allegations. When feminism is turning to not just focus on women as the sole stakeholder, but also recognize the problems of men, is it fair that we still call ourselves feminist when there is such an important male side and sector of the movement, really?
Let me just ask an open question from you guys. What do you think feminism is? To agree or disagree, we first have to know what it is that we are agreeing or disagreeing with.
That point. Since this, okay, Menaka says, feminist is someone who believes in the social and economic equality of the genders. Okay.
Okay, now that's a good starting point, right? Feminism, very good. Feminist is someone who believes in the socio-economic equality of all genders, right? For me, feminism is understanding gender oppression at a larger scale. Remember the question, when a child is born, boy, girl, and having these stereotypes, okay? For me, the understanding in feminism there is that this patriarchy, right, is as oppressive towards, is very oppressive towards women, and it's oppressive towards men as well, right? So you spoke about men who are compelled to be breadwinners, right? Who are compelled to play a certain role, men who can be wrongfully prosecuted, right? If you look at incarceration and then the intersectionality with other aspects of identity like race, right, caste and class, what we see is that, for me, patriarchy is a system of oppression that actually affects the way both men and women navigate and are treated in society, right? So for me personally, feminism is about addressing that oppression. And then another aspect of it is, remember we talked about systematic inequalities, right? You don't have access to education, access to health. If you're like aborted because you're a girl, right? You don't even have access to life when you look at female infanticide. So if you want to talk about systematic inequalities, we can even talk about pre-death elimination, right? And that's what I love. Remember when we said, what's a woman? And two of you said resilience. And that's where it really strikes me, because I think given the structures that we have and the bodies that we have, we do go through a lot of hardship as women. But that also then is countered by our resilience and our ability to kind of, power through all of that. And I think like recognizing that and giving that value and worth without saying, oh, it's just a woman's job, or it's just a feminine thing, right? Bringing back that power. Like Shanali, you talked about empowerment as soon as you think of women, right? So first, I think recognizing that resilience is a big part of that. And then also feminism, just very quickly want to tell you, there are so many branches of feminism, right? That's radical feminism. There is ecofeminism. So these are feminists who see our exploitation of the natural world as just being an exploitation of other people's bodies and the exploitation of women, right? So it's not just some blanket thing, right? It's not like as soon as you think feminism, people think of bra burning, and I'm like, no, I've never burned my bra, and it's like, no, right?
Expensive for that.
Exactly. I think we're stuck in stereotypes, but for me, it's like, yes, the belief in the equality of men and women doesn't mean that men and women need to be the same, right? That's another thing. A lot of people think, oh, that means that we have to be like men. I'm like, no. Have that diversity, whatever your identity, but treat all such people with dignity, whether it's being someone who's a woman or a disabled woman or like a refugee woman, and I'm so glad, Shania, that you mentioned it, because intersectionality also plays a big role in all of this, right? So it's complex, but it's about, kind of imagining a fairer, more equitable world.
Yeah. So Amaya actually has put an opinion in the chat that I've heard a lot of people say, and I've heard a lot of discussions about, and it's, truth be told, it is very true, because she says, I kind of feel that feminism is pretty polarized. Most people don't focus on men being oppressed. Also, shouldn't it be about equity and not about equality? What's just for me might not be just for you. So making space for individuality is also what's important, right? Amaya, I think, like, yes, this is really true. And I think a lot of people also don't like the label feminism because they feel like it has been exclusively talking about women's issues and only women's issues. And I think that's a criticism that maybe as members of the feminist movement, we need to take to heart, because that maybe might have been what it was. Ms. Niluka, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll actually, this is a good question. I want to ask, just put the question out there to all of you. Does anyone have any opinion on this? Because it's quite a valid concern.
Yeah, do you feel like feminism has been polarized? Do you feel like you've talked to people who say that they're feminist but refuse to acknowledge that men have struggles too?
Come on, don't be shy. I'm sure you guys have good ideas out there. Nice. Okay, so I have a, I'm so glad you all are participating on the chat. Okay, cool. So I'm also gonna now step in here. It's interesting, right? Feminism can lead to polarization, but this is the thing, right? I think if you don't, if you can't talk about equality or equity without, wait, let's see. Okay, so it's like this, right? If you can't necessarily talk about equality and equity without talking about oppression, right? So oppressive systems can be patriarchy, racist structures, ableism, right? So many different ways in which people are oppressed, especially when you take patriarchy, right? It's called heteropatriarchy. Patriarchy is dependent upon very specific roles for men and women, right? And a compulsory heterosexuality, or the understanding that there is attraction just between men and women, okay? And a very reproductive understanding of sexuality. So the thing is, firstly, that affects both men and women. So we can't talk about gendered oppression without recognizing that both men and women are affected by that. Okay, then you would think, yes, if they are both affected, why do we talk about women so much, right? Because women tend to be the more devalued party within this structure, right? So why have we talked about women? Women didn't have the right to vote, you know, women didn't have the right to go to university, women didn't have the right to get employed, okay? And still it's not like hunky-dory, right? Like I said, only 28% of women go into senior management, right? Systematically, historically, there has been inequality where people had to fight for women's suffrage. That means the right to vote, right? To a fight for women to go to universities. So all these have been struggles, right? And that's why feminism historically has been influenced and colored by those struggles for equality, right? That's where this comes in. It's not like randomly that people started focusing on women, okay? And it's not randomly that people start focusing like Black Lives Matter, right? There has been historically subjugation, slavery, right? Police violence, all these things are realities. So you can say, how can you talk about race without talking about white people? You're like, yes, yes, when you talk about race relations, it's all about both Black and white people. But you need to also see that there has been these grave injustices and oppressions that need to be spoken of. And that's where, Amaya, I think your question is really important, because while we speak of equality, and I mentioned this several times, equity is very important, right? You can't, if the playing ground is not even, yeah, you cannot have an even game. So why we need equity is to make allowances for those variations, right? So it depends. I mean, yes, we talk of equality, but that equality is informed by an understanding of structural inequalities, which then need to be addressed through equity measures.
Yeah. And Amaya, I actually really agree with your point where you say that you can't say that all the same opportunities have been given to all men in the same way, because it depends on religion and culture too, and also just like what's going on in the world right now. I think in a lot of situations right now, because of the perception that men are more violent and extreme or prone to being involved in extremist ideologies or groups like that, there is a lot of flack that men of particular groups get. For example, black men being held at gunpoint and being stopped and frisked would happen a lot more than it would to a white man or to a black woman. So in certain situations, there are places where the men get the brunt of it. I remember when I was small and the war was still going on, I'm Tamil. My family's Tamil. And my brother, being a Tamil boy, man at that time, would get stopped at security checkpoints far more than my mother would, and held up a lot more once they realized that he was a Tamil man and a young Tamil man. And they would just have so many more questions for him. And I understand why, I guess, because of the LTT situation. But again, it was a problem that was a lot more exclusive to him than it was to the women of the family. So yeah, your masculinity can really be a hurdle and a barrier.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm looking at the last one about blacks being racist towards whites. I think it's about, again, like how we perpetuate stereotypes, right? Stereotypes of what it is to be a man, what is it is to be a Tamil man during, the time of war. Like, I think that's why it becomes complex, because we are not just at the end of the day men and women, right? We have all these other intersecting factors that also then determine our lived experience.
Yeah, and I guess maybe right now in Sri Lanka, it might be most difficult to be perhaps a Muslim man, because of, I remember after the April bombings, I had a friend whose uncle was Muslim, and the cops were called on him literally just for that. They were asked to search his house for no other reason except that he was a Muslim man who was a businessman at that time, and that was the information coming out. So maybe this is what we're facing right now. That's not to say that there aren't issues facing women of them being assumed of being part of extremist ideologies and whatnot, but it might be something that affects men more.
Yeah.
If I can just comment, I think building on that, it is a very multidimensional issue. So while you are looking at gender, can you hear me?
A little bit, yeah.
I feel like we also need to consider like different aspects of class and race and ethnicity and how they play into that. Because that's why, while, for example, you might have issues when it comes to being a woman, you might have other privileges, which might not make all other statements apply to you. Like, for example, we're talking about access to education in being a woman. But if you're of a certain socioeconomic class, you are therefore more, it's easier for you to access that option. So I feel like it's all intertwined and you can't necessarily just speak about one without considering the others. And that's why when it comes to movements like Black Lives Matter and even like the feminist movement, it doesn't mean that one particular argument will apply as like a blanket statement to everyone else, but it's still something that needs to be considered. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Alina, for sharing, because at the end of the day, it's about intersectionality. It's about privilege, right? Or relative privileges that we have based on, like where we are at, right? So maybe, let's say in Sri Lanka, being like, I don't know, singular Buddhist might put you kind of further up that hierarchy of privilege. But if you go to like France, you being singular Buddhist is like whatever, right? So it's very contextual as well. And it's like you said, quite complex, and also, yeah, so and I think that's where cross movement collaboration is very important. Like traditionally movements have been very insular and isolated, so feminist movement, disability rights movement, whatever, you know, racial justice, but as we move then from these movements to more like a great understanding of social justice, then we really need to have these conversations, not just with men, but with people working with sex workers, you know, people working on laborers' rights, because all these things become relevant to our work, right? So that's where our commitment to cross-movement collaboration is important. So thank you so much for raising that point. And then I think in terms of this question on stereotypes separated from oppression and also power imbalances, the question from by Mikal, yes, oppression is base, the foundation. No, well, the impact of oppression and both, and also the foundation of oppression is power imbalance. And the reason why then we have to talk specifically either about women or Black people is because this power imbalance exists, right? And can stereotypes be separated from oppression? I think oppression needs stereotypes to be there to work, you know, so that we view others in stereotypical ways and we also view ourselves in stereotypical ways.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting thing. I was just trying to figure out, can there be oppression without stereotypes? Is that possible?
It's a great question, right?
I don't think so. What do you guys think?
I think if we're trying oppression into like the whole power imbalance thing, I think it also comes into like the type of society that we live in outside of necessarily stereotypes. Even just the fact that we live in a capitalist society, it's accumulation by dispossession. So regardless, for someone to profit off it or benefit off it, you have to have someone who's on the lower end of the spectrum. And that's not necessarily a gender thing, but outside of the stereotypes thing, I would say.
But yeah, but the capitalist point does actually impact gender stereotypes and gender expectations, because like, I mean, if I was born into a different family that maybe wasn't so wealthy, if my dad didn't have a job, I would be considering being a domestic worker, possibly, right? Whereas for me right now, that was never ever a consideration. So yeah, in a way that was never a stereotype for me to not be a domestic worker, but it just, because of the forces at hand and the way life worked out, it's just not.
Yeah, I think this is also really important, Alina, because if we look at, you know, women who go into informal sector work, right? Women who are factory workers, women who are like domestic workers in the Middle East, all this is a result of capitalism, like, and the neoliberal economics and the way in which we organize society, right? Remember we talked about what kind of work do we value? So capitalism has very distinct ways of valuing work, right? If it's informal, these values are the undercurrent of it is capitalism, right? So, but we need to like start thinking more critically about it.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up soon since it's 12:30 and we've kind of gone over time because the questions just kept flowing. But last question from Amaya. What if you work hard and get into a wealthy position, but then you're blamed for being privileged and for being rich? I think that does happen quite a lot now. We tend to, if someone comes from a background of privilege, if they happen to be white, if they happen to be Sinhala Buddhist, if they happen to be wealthy, we do tend to discount their opinions sometimes and say that they don't know what they're talking about.
Does anyone have any thoughts?
It's very interesting, Amaya, because I think this also brings back the question of privilege, right? I mean, is it like this snakes and ladders situation where we have fortunes and misfortunes and we're like going up and down, or it's privilege? So it's very interesting. Like if you look at different markers, right? So this is somewhat related because in my personal experience, I feel like, let's say if you are a trans person, who has transitioned, that seems to be more acceptable to being either gay or lesbian, right? In terms of, because those binaries, the gender binaries are maintained. If you say you're trans and then you transition, you're like, okay, distinction between men and women, heterosexual desire, you assume it's heterosexual desire, but there are lots of trans people who are also gay, right? But there's an idea that it remains so, okay? So in terms of like privilege also, I think if whatever change that occurs maintains the social structure in place, right? Uh, then that becomes acceptable. But if it disrupts it, then that may not be seen as a point of privilege. So I'm thinking in terms of what you said, in terms of income. Okay, yeah. I think income is one of the few ways in which, we talked about intersectionality access. In terms of access to privilege, income is one of the main ways in which you can change your social stance, but that still is kind of subject to scrutiny, right? So like, in Sri Lanka, people say, alut salli, mudalalila, like people who have become rich, but then you demean because you're not like, your family isn't rich, you're not historically rich, right? So even if you look at the so-called rich people and privileged people, there are hierarchies within that as well, okay? So it becomes hard. It's yeah, to navigate all those different factors.
Yeah, it's funny because new rich would insinuate that you actually worked for it, right? But for some reason, we give that more flack than the old historic families that come from wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately, we have to wrap up now. But I'd just like to thank, firstly, everyone who signed up for this and who logged on, sent us questions. I think you not only helped us figure out what this webinar would be about, but as the webinar went on, I think it really evolved into more than just what we had planned. And I think I can speak for the whole Greetings from Lanka team when I say that we're really, really thankful for that, because this webinar was never meant to be what we wanted to talk about. It's what we thought that it was more about what do Sri Lankans in school and in university need to talk about, what do we want to talk about, what's lacking from our lives. And I think that because of your participation, we really got this. So secondly, thank you so much to Ms.Niluka for being our panelist and for knowing so much about what we're talking about, because none of us would have been able to give the same insights simply in terms of research or in terms of actual experience that you would have. So thank you so much for being a part of this. And yeah, I hope that when we have our future events, we can count on all of you to be a part of them, and also to send us ideas for what you'd like to hear. Because we were thinking maybe we need to do more about being trans in Sri Lanka. Maybe we need to talk more about sexuality in specific. Do we need to talk about ragging? Do we need to talk about sex education, whether it should be there or not? So yeah, if you have any ideas, you know that you can always contact us on our Instagram page, on our Facebook page, by messaging us if you know us, email, anything. So yeah, thank you everyone. It is now lunchtime.
Great. Thank you so much. Just want to say that I have so much hope in my heart just coming across young women and men like you guys. I'm assuming there are men here, but this is great. Please keep the conversation moving forward, and I think it can be very enriching for a lot of us. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks guys. See you later.
Bye.
Hi, Anushka.
It's like I want to say something, but he's there. No?
What do you mean?
think he just left it there and he went somewhere for sure.
Anushka, if you're here, say something. Wave.
He totally left us. My God, he's such a...
Long gone.
And he just, I can't believe he changed his name to GFL.
He did. I thought Alina did that and I was so confused.
That was him.
I was like,
I sent it to him and I sent him a video.